What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be talking about Swamp Thing. So about 2 months ago at this point, I covered Captain America from 1990 with my buddy, the Crosby Critic, and I talked about in that video that the reason that I was inspired to go back and revisit that terrible Captain America film is because I came across a tweet on Twitter where somebody was literally listing off all the various comic book movies that they thought were the worst comic book movies of all time. And on that list, you'd see things like Wonder Woman 1984, the most recent Morbius, things like Batman vs. Superman, and a bunch of other movies that some of them I can agree weren't the best, but are nowhere near the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to comic book movie adaptations. Let's look at something like Morbius. That's a modern comic book movie that was not critically well received, as well not very well received by the audiences, and did not do very well in the box office. For me, a lackluster film with decent performances, really cool action and cool visuals, but ultimately a lackluster story that really is what for me held it back from being really good. With that said, by no means would I even say Morbius is even close to the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to comic book movies. So that's why we're going to be talking about Swamp Thing today, as I continue to go back and revisit some movies to remind you guys truly what are the worst comic book movies that have ever been made. Written and directed by Wes Craven, the legendary Wes Craven. It's kind of crazy to think of him actually writing and directing this. Swamp Thing is a comic book adaptation of the DC character of the same name, and this film stars people like Ray Weisz, Dick Durock, Louis Jourdan, Adrienne Barbeau, and has a score from Harry Manfredini that gives this film a very Friday the 13th vibe. Before we get too far into this, I'd like to thank my guest for this video, and that is Dave from Interpreting the Stars, once again here on the channel, this time around to join me as we revisit a horrible comic book movie adaptation, once again, as I mentioned earlier, to remind people of what truly are the worst comic book movies ever made. If you have not seen the review I did for the 1990 Captain America, I highly suggest going and checking that video out. But here we are talking about Swamp Thing from 1982, coming to us from Wes Craven. If you've been here on this channel for quite some time, then you know that I have been a huge fan of Wes Craven, whether it's the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise or the Scream franchise. Wes Craven has gone on to create a legacy of being one of the most iconic filmmakers of all time, creating some of the most iconic scenes and characters that have ever graced the screen. He both wrote this film and directed it, and yeah, this film is weak. I'm not going to even lie in any way, shape, or form. This film is the worst thing that I think a movie can be, as I've said on this channel before, and that is boring. With Captain America 1990, that was a bad movie, but I found myself still entertained by how bad it was. This one had a similar quality, but it kind of wore off after a while. This movie is painfully boring, and it really doesn't have a lot going on for it. With Captain America 1990, it's so cheesy and has elements that are so ridiculous in it that you can at least still laugh at the fact that the film was made and that it has a full streamlined narrative to follow, even if it's a weak narrative. When it comes to this movie, the narrative is just so hollow, and it also just kind of feels so scattered that it sometimes is hard to really care about anything that's going on in this movie or even latch on to the events that are taking place. The basic premise of this film is you have Dr. Alec Holland, who is being protected by a group of kind of militia type men, or just, you know, he has like a group of security around him as he's working on some sort of chemical that will help plants grow in areas that they typically wouldn't grow and deal with harsh environments. What he doesn't know is that there's a man named Arcane with a group of criminals who is close on their tail and is coming to take out all of his security group, take out Dr. Holland, and get this chemical for themselves. When they end up getting there and causing some ruckus, this ends up falling onto Dr. Holland, the chemical, turning him into Swamp Thing. At the center of the story, we have Alice Cable, a woman who's coming in to work alongside Dr. Holland, played by Adrienne Barbeau, and they end up having a bit of a Beauty and the Beast romance that builds very rapidly, and yeah, that's pretty much the movie. Over the course of the movie, Arcane would end up being able to create his own version of this serum, making himself into a pig-like monster at the end of the film. And there's another guy that turns into a bit of like a little weasel, you know, short dwarf kind of character that looks kind of like a rat. Yeah, if this all sounds incredibly bizarre to you, that's because this film is, a lot of this movie is Arcane's men looking for Swamp Thing or looking for Adrienne Barbeau's character Cable throughout the course of the film as she's running away from them. This movie is horrible in every way, shape, or form. The performances from beginning to end are laughable. There are moments of line delivery that will genuinely make you laugh, and there are times that the lines themselves are worse than the line delivery. So then you have poor line delivery on top of poor lines, and it's just bad. Beyond that, the editing for this film is laughably bad as it uses pretty much every single bit of basic PowerPoint transitions between every single scene. You can't help but laugh when you watch this movie going back. The performances, as I mentioned, they just don't sell you on anything that's happening here. And I tried to give this movie the benefit of the doubt at times, but it's truly just a boring film with a lackluster story, lackluster characters, performances that just make you want to laugh throughout, and lines that just don't make sense at times. And even when they do make sense, they're usually delivered really poorly, and it's just a movie that when it comes to the execution on all levels, it's bad. The special effects are bad. When we have our character Dr. Alec Holland who turns into Swamp Thing, the practical makeup they did on Swamp Thing is laughable. It's just a dude in a rubber suit, and him himself, Swamp Thing, never really says anything. When he does say stuff, it's kind of inaudible at times. There are times where it's a little bit difficult to understand what he's saying. And another part of that has to lead into the sound mix, because I found the sound mix for this film to be atrocious. There are moments where certain volumes are way higher than others. There are moments where characters are walking and their footsteps are just as loud, if not louder, than their voices. Not to mention the film is almost 90% ADR, with most of the dialogue not actually being captured on camera in those moments, and most of it having to be stuff where they came back after the fact and recorded their lines over the scenes, and you could just tell their mouths don't work. And there's literally a scene in this film where one of the militia men who ends up getting taken out by Swamp Thing is literally talking with a cigar in his mouth, trying to almost make him look like a cartoon character, and you can very much tell that he recorded his lines after the fact, and he sounds nothing like somebody who has something in their mouth the entire time. It, in every way, shape, or form, is laughably bad when it comes to the post-production elements that they added to this film and the stuff that was actually captured on camera. There is never even a moment in this movie where I found myself engaged or even feeling impressed by a single thing that they pulled off in this movie. Now, of course, this movie came out in 1982, so I gotta take into account what was available to them at the time and recognize that this wasn't Wes Craven as he would later on become. But yeah, you know, based on the movies that had already come out at this time, this is definitely a weak film of this era, and not one I think many people are gonna remember. Now, I definitely have a few more things to say on this movie, but before I wrap up my thoughts on Swamp Thing, I'm gonna go ahead and pass it off to Dave from Interpreting the Stars. We're gonna get back to my thoughts in a moment.
Hey, what's up, Anthony and all his viewers? My name's Dave from Interpreting the Stars, and Anthony here has asked me to join him on his channel to talk about this movie, if that's what you can call it, Swamp Thing, which initially I thought was supposed to be like the creature from the Black Lagoon, or maybe a remake of it or something. I clearly knew nothing about it in general, but no, that would undoubtedly be better than this, which was, I don't even have a word for it, but at least Anthony had a good point. People that call current comic book movies the worst ever comic book, clearly they have never taken a trip down memory lane and watched these older comic book films, because, whoa boy, this one hurt. All I have to say is, Wes Craven? Man, you're better than this. I feel so embarrassed and ashamed for you. How do you go from The Hills Have Eyes to this to A Nightmare on Elm 1? I don't understand any of it. Swamp Thing's about a scientist doing scientist-y experiments on swamp life, currently in the process of trying to create an elixir that can mix animal and plant DNA together to create a more sustainable environment in deader climates such as deserts. But everything goes awry when a few badder-than-bad guys show up, ready to steal his work, and the scientist accidentally pours the elixir all over himself, combusts into a ball of fire, runs a quarter mile until he falls into the swamp and becomes the indestructible Swamp Thing. Half man, half swamp. Oh boy. What? Who out there thinks a swamp setting is even all that interesting, especially for a story about an ugly hero? Anti-hero? I mean, what is this thing? Because I don't know. But he's ugly as sin. On a good day, this dude looks like a bad 90s Power Ranger villain, and he fights like one too. Especially towards the end, when there's like another ugly monster thing that's obviously a rubber suit and fake mask. That's what the Swamp Thing basically has to fight at the end of the film, in a movie that basically has no plot, and all those bad guys in general are just basic mustache twirling bad guys that just want to do the same thing as the scientist instead of just plain old trying to hire the man. No, let's kill him and the entire team and hope that the elixir that they're working on is ready. I mean, if it's not, whoops. Man, this is dumpster fire if ever I've seen it. I mean, seriously, the whole thing, it's just like pointless bad guys being bad for no reason. And this Swamp Thing is hitting them, which makes him good or something. I have no idea. This is a masterclass in crap and a beautiful display of an absolute disaster. The only redeeming quality that I see here is very, very small moments of the film that utilize practical effects, like specifically where the villains start to transform. There's some moments there that do look nice, but the end result of what they transform into always looks like crap anyways. And the editing, I almost never give editing a bad score, because in general, editors are usually really good at what they do, or at bare minimum, they usually take a safe, unchallenging approach to how they edit the film. Almost never, ever do you see an editor basically go out of their way to make the editing look like crap. Swamp Thing? What do the editors do in this movie? You know those basic wipe transitions that you would see in any basic video editor, especially with Windows Movie Maker? It's like the editor of Swamp Thing suddenly discovered those, and every chance they had, used one of these wiping transitions in between all the scenes. It happens a ton of times in this movie. A wipe to the left, a wipe to the right, a wipe up, a wipe down, a star wipe, a circle wipe, a diagonal wipe. It's non-stop and it looks stupid. That's the kind of wipe that you might anticipate seeing on Microsoft PowerPoint. Star Wars does do it sometimes, but even they make them look cool at least. This was just constantly in your face bad. You ever hear of a cut transition, man? A crossfade maybe? Fade to black? Fade to white? These wipes, I ended up laughing every time that they happened because they were just so obvious. I don't know. The 80s were supposed to be a time that we look back at fondly of and use as an example of when movies were good, and how everything that we make nowadays, it's just copycats, you know? Remakes, reimaginings, reboots, all on stuff that happened in the 80s. And maybe that's just not always the case. Because in the case of Swamp Thing, I was the opposite of engaged with this film. Holy moly. Looking at my final score for a second, I'll throw that up really quick, because obviously I think it sucks, and it's getting a failing letter grade of F, and total score of 24%, which is not good at all. But that final score is comprised of the unbiased score of 46% and the biased score of a whole whopping 2%. That's how I felt about the movie. 2%. And that mainly comes into play where I thought the practical effects of the villains transforming did look pretty nice, like I said, but everything else was pretty much absolutely horrid. The 46% score for the unbiased, that was basically when I'm honest about its technical achievements. So, no, the costume designs didn't look good, the editing was a nightmare, but everything else seemed to be pretty much business as usual, and they did what they wanted to do, even if what they wanted to do wasn't all that good. So that's why it had a better score overall there, but at the end of the day, a 24% score is pretty abysmal, I'd say. Anyways, thanks Anthony for inviting me over to your channel to talk about Swamp Thing. I can't say it was a pleasure, but it was something, I guess. So, until the next one, cheers and peace out.
A big thanks to Dave for joining me here in this video. Loved hearing your thoughts, man, and I appreciate you taking your time to join me on the journey of revisiting this horrible comic book movie adaptation. Loved hearing your thoughts, and similar to you, just complete shock and awe that Wes Craven is the man at the helm of this. And it really just goes to show that, you know, even if you create something in whatever creative field that you're in, don't give up on yourself, because as long as you practice, as they say, practice makes perfect, and continue to push on, maybe even you as well can be able to create something just as iconic as A Nightmare on Elm Street or things like Scream. When you look at what Wes Craven would later do with his career versus a film like this, it's almost inspiring. As I told my fiance as we were watching this, I was just almost inspired watching this because of how bad this movie is and how great this filmmaker would end up becoming. Now, one thing that was actually funny to me when I was watching this movie, and I mentioned earlier that this film is scored by Harry Manfredini, who actually did the music for Friday the 13th, and not only the original, but plenty of the sequels, most of them, as well as spin-offs and various fan films and the video game. His music has been used all over the place when it comes to that franchise, and it's pretty funny because throughout the course of this film, I kept telling my fiance, this film feels like a bad Friday the 13th film. Now, a lot of the Friday the 13th films are bad, to be completely honest. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that I am a huge fan of the slasher genre, and even for the worst films in the Jason franchise, I still have a very special place in my heart for those movies, and so the music is integral to that experience when it comes to the Friday the 13th films. Even if I feel a certain film in that franchise it's bad, it's got a guilty pleasure kind of thing in my heart. But Harry Manfredini's music is just so noticeable and iconic, and it genuinely feels like, outside of the iconic Friday the 13th themes, that this is just another Friday the 13th theme, minus the iconic Jason theme that we hear throughout the course of those films. There were so many moments in this film in terms of its tone, its look, its feel, its vibe, outside of the murders and the gratuitous violence, that it felt very much like a Friday the 13th film, but unfortunately not in the best ways. It didn't capture the cheese and the charm that the Friday the 13th films are able to capture so well, but I did enjoy the score. It took me back to feeling like I was watching a Friday the 13th film. Unfortunately, this film does not have the same entertainment value of a Friday the 13th film, though. I don't know what else to say. I just wanted to do this video to tell you guys, Swamp Thing 1982 it's weak, man. It's a weak film. Like, at the end of the day, it's a weak film. It's got really bad performances, and you don't really even know what it is that's wrong about this film, because some of these actors and actresses would go on to be in other things that were better. This is just not one of the good things that they were in. When I look at somebody like Ray Wise, he's been in so many great films and TV shows after this movie, and so this is definitely not a high point for him. And I would even argue that he's not really an issue with this film, to be completely honest. It's after he turns into Swamp Thing that things just continually get worse and worse and worse, and it wasn't even him that was Swamp Thing. So he becomes Swamp Thing, but then he's not even the main character after a while, or the title character once he becomes Swamp Thing, because that is Dick Durock, who pretty much just plays a big monster guy. He says a couple of lines of dialogue, but there are really awkward moments with Swamp Thing in this movie where he's just kind of looking at somebody, or something is said to him, and he's just kind of staring at the camera, and it doesn't have any emotion. There's nothing about this film that makes you care for Swamp Thing. They try to make him a misunderstood kind of character that you can have some sympathy for, and you can feel for him on that level, that it's just a guy who had an accident happen to him. You don't hate the character. He's not like you're afraid of him while you're watching the movie. You recognize that he is the misunderstood monster. But this movie in and of itself, I feel, never really did anything for me to latch on to this iteration of Swamp Thing. I never found myself engaged in the story. The romance is completely rushed. There are segments of this movie that could easily be cut 100%. There's so many bad, laughable moments of dialogue. And honestly, by the time the movie was wrapping up, I just found myself getting sleepy. I found my eyes getting heavy, which for me is the absolute complete sign of a boring film. And as I've said here on the channel on dozens and dozens of occasions, the worst thing a movie can be for me is boring. I am so on board for a it's so bad, it's good kind of movie, and unfortunately that is not the case here with Wes Craven's Swamp Thing from 1982, as this is, for me, one of the worst comic book films ever made. So next time you're thinking, hey, is Wonder Woman 1984 one of the worst comic book movies ever made? No, go back and check out 1982 Swamp Thing, written and directed by Wes Craven, somebody who would go on to become one of the most legendary directors and writers of all time, and this was certainly a misstep in his career, if you ask my genuine opinion. With that said, a big thanks to my guest in this video, Dave from Interpreting the Stars. You guys can, as usual, find the links to any of my guests down below in the description box. Go give them some love, let them know I sent you. But for now, I'm gonna wrap up my thoughts by saying that Swamp Thing 1982 is just a ridiculously bad film that doesn't even have the quality of being it's so bad it's good, that I would honestly give that quality to something like Captain America 1990, because there are elements of that film that are so laughably bad that you can still find entertainment value, whereas with this movie, it's just boring and not much happens, and it's just It's bad. It's a bad movie, guys. A big thanks to you guys for watching. Hit that like button if you guys enjoyed this video, and please comment your thoughts. Do you like this movie? Do you not like this movie? And to Dave, who's probably watching this video, and I'm gonna let him figure it out right here, we will be jumping into Swamp Thing 2. So expect to see Dave here on the channel in the near future as we cover Swamp Thing 2. And yeah, I'm not sure if I'll cover a lot more Swamp Thing stuff here on the channel, but Swamp Thing 2 is definitely going to be covered at some point in the future. But a big thanks to you guys for watching. Comment your thoughts, subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.